versus something that's safer over here, that's clearly safer. You don't wait for a 30-year study. You start taking action now to promote the safer alternative. And to me, this is exactly what we're dealing with vaping right now. And I just pose the question to you. Imagine if we had been unsuccessful in persuading governments to change those policies about blood and condoms and clean needles. What would be the effect of 30 years of failing to address the HIV epidemic have been on our country? It would have been catastrophic.
Yeah, maybe I can add to this. I think there's I don't know what the rhetorical device is where you, in a discussion about an issue, you say, well, there's one extreme and that extreme is completely unacceptable, and the other extreme, which is sort of under attack but is the ideal. So I think we got to be careful not to mischaracterize this. I remember when we were working on Bill 45, and it includes the Electronic Cigarettes Act, and there were all kinds of statements made about this act is going to, quote, ban vaping. It in no way banned vaping, and nor will any of the regulations that are coming in, if they ever do, who knows, ban vaping. Vaping is permitted. The problem is the same one that I mentioned at the beginning, nicotine. If we were talking about devices that did not contain nicotine, I think we'd be having a completely different discussion. But we are talking about devices that contain nicotine, and we're talking about proponents of being allowed to use them anywhere versus the legislation which says you can't use them in indoor spaces where smoking is prohibited. That is primarily driven by a concern that people who are not vapors not be exposed to nicotine indoors. I don't want my kids, I don't think anybody here would want their kids, whatever your status of vaping or smoking or non-smoking or whatever, I don't think anyone wants their kids exposed to nicotine in any way that might pre-addict them, might predispose them to smoking cigarettes or to some form of nicotine ingestion for the rest of their lives. Nicotine, we haven't even talked about the fact that there's some direct health effects with nicotine, particularly in not as a cause of cancer, but as a probable promoter of tumor growth for those who have cancer, which is why it's so important for people who have cancer to stop smoking. It may appear, well, it's too late. It's not too late to at least help their status as patients. So there are some issues around simply the exposure to nicotine that I think, among others, led, at least Ontario, as I understand it, to put the no vaping where no smoking rule, well, it's not in place yet, but in the regulations.
I don't know if that's something that we should pursue at this point. I think that is one part of the research that we don't know enough about. There was a survey of American doctors whether nicotine caused cancer, and 70% said yes, based on no data. So nicotine is not a cancer causer. It's pretty the suspect. The data I'm involved in trying to get a study going of vaping for cancer patients who are continuing to smoke. So I think that that is a small issue. I think that that's still out. Nicotine for a lot of people is a very positive substance. So that's the reality also. My practice has been with people with other harder drug habits and mental health issues, and nicotine is highly important for them. So this idea that nicotine is an evil substance, I think, is again not based on hard science, and that a lot of people benefit from nicotine, and they should have the right to use it like we drink coffee.
Very quickly, I just want to say the equivalency between nicotine, vapor, and secondhand smoke is absolute balderdash. There's no science to support that at all. You got a lot more harmful effects from going outside and breathing automobile exhaust, and yet we allow people to drive cars. There's just no science to support that at all.
Well, let's talk about the science then. So the Government of Canada's Health Minister, Jane Philpott, has mentioned in her statement when she announced Bill S5 that science is, quote, catching up to vaping. So I take that to mean that Health Canada may accept evidence in the future and possibly dismantle some of the safety concerns that seem to plague the vaping industry at present. My question is this: what science and what evidence exists globally on vaping, and what leads people like Minister Philpott to be able to make those kinds of comments? So I'll turn to the doctor first. Mark, would you like to take this?
Well, I find it very fascinating how we got into this position in the first place, and that's how vaping started, as very grassroots, and people who are trying to make themselves healthier and stop smoking is really behind this, right from Han Lick in China to where it is now. And so it didn't go through the randomized clinical trials that all other products have, including nicotine patches. So we're in this area that there's been no big pharma to develop these massive trials that are highly expensive. And so we throw our hands up and say, well, we don't have the evidence. And I think there's so many people. I think we can do a much better job of it, and we should try to organize good studies, but nobody wants to pay for them. And so I think we'll be having this discussion in 5 years from now, that we still don't have like really hard scientific studies following people. And so we have to think of other ways to get our message out there and the evidence out there. So but it's a very weak argument to say we have to wait for a clinical trial because we really don't know what this is doing to people, when there's just so much evidence out there in other ways that we need to be much smarter in gathering. And I think public health and the medical community are on the skeptic side. So I stand out in my public health community as some kind of maniac who's out there trying to kill children with nicotine. And so I think that there's a huge shift we need to make within the medical community. I don't know how many people have watched 1 Billion Lives, but I've watched it. Like there's a lot of vested interest in this, and I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, but there's at least a big inertia in the whole community of doctors, because there's a lot of money to be generated and made with heart disease and cancer, and there's not many doctors are out there really working hard stopping people from smoking, and so we have to have a shift in the whole medical leadership, and that would in turn help promote research around it, because nobody's really even asking these questions in the medical community.
I hear Michael taking deep breaths.
Yeah, the idea that doctors are somehow out there being pleased with their patients smoking because they get sick and give them more work and more income, I think is remarkably cynical, but I'll leave that.
Well, I think I'm just talking the reality. Most physicians are quite happy to tell their patients that they should stop smoking, and when they don't, they tell them they should stop smoking. I mean, there's really not a concerted effort. There's a few. I worked in Ottawa for 4 years. They probably have the most successful inpatient smoking cessation.
Yeah.
But that's an anomaly.
A hospital inpatient.
Yeah, it's
process.
an anomaly across Canada that it's not really high on the agenda of most medical people.
Well, and part of the reason for that, I wouldn't say it's not high on the agenda. I'd say that most physicians' experience with patients who try to stop smoking, and this is where vaping and similar products become of interest, and this is why we're having this discussion today and why vaping products are on the market, is because traditional methods, counseling, patch, gum, etc., don't work. They work for some smokers, but they don't work for a lot of smokers. Many of you, they didn't work for. So the product invented in China, and which has been subject to all kinds of evolutionary, development over the last 5 to 10 years, we think there's definitely room for it in the whole area of helping people who are addicted to tobacco products get off them. The question is, what's the process under which that happens? I think we've got the panel's agreement here on let's not sell vaping products to kids. Where we differ is what evidentiary basis should there be, and that's all we work on. We don't work on anecdotal stories, although we're aware of them. We look at the evidence. As I mentioned, the Public Health Ontario report looked at all the available evidence up to late last year and came to certain conclusions. Now, you can diss those conclusions based on whatever one's personal experience in one's professional life is, but we have to work on a basis of evidence. Health Canada got caught completely flat-footed, as we all know. They put out a statement in '09 saying vaping products should not be approved for sale, or none are legal that are not approved by us for sale, and then did nothing about it. So the marketplace was left to experiment, and many of you have experimented successfully. There's nothing wrong with that at all. The question is, how do we, first of all, accelerate the investigation, not so much into the long-term health effects, because we won't know long-term health effects until there have been long-term vapors. Anybody vaped longer than 10 years here? What, the average, 5 years? Okay. So, very short period of time. That's not, I don't think anyone in our community says, well, because there's only a 5 or 6 or 7 year history here, and we don't have a 30-year clinical trial, therefore these products should be banned. No one says that. So to even suggest that there's anyone out there inferring that or saying it is just wrong. The problem is, we've got a product where the marketplace got way ahead of the scientific and medical communities. And how do we deal with that? Everyone that I know in the tobacco field that also is interested in vaping because of the relationship with nicotine, and I would not characterize nicotine as a benign substance by any means, no one I know does, is to catch up in some way that provides guidance to policymakers that actually is meaningful. In other words, the idea of people who are trying to quit smoking could vape. People who don't smoke, there's no reason for them to vape. There's no evidence to contradict those statements. But that doesn't mean that people aren't going to experiment with it. We're particularly concerned with our kids. I think we've settled that issue here. So the question becomes, what basis of policy, what basis of evidence should inform our policy going forward? And that's a constantly evolving situation.
Arthur?
So there's a little problem in this notion of using vaping only as harm reduction. I mean, let's face it, the people who are in the business, you're also in the business to sell product. And what I'm kind of hearing, it might be the direction that if you want it for harm reduction only, you might need a doctor's note. Hey, I'm a smoker, I want to get off it, I'll go get a vapor. And if you don't have that doctor's note, maybe you won't be eligible. But you're actually in the business of selling product. And to pretend that you don't want to market the product to make money off the product is actually not to be, fully truthful with the business cases that you're all facing. So while harm reduction is one of the greatest arguments I think you have to not to be banned and such, but there's still this notion of we want people to use our products, to buy our vapors, to buy our and so you're going to have to, as an industry, get your mind around that part. It's not just harm reduction, is it a legitimate activity? Because in my mind, we don't want people smoking, ingesting foreign materials. So if it's a way of harm reduction to get off of vaping, that should be a direction too. So that's a problem I think we have to face, is that is it a legitimate activity in addition to being harm reduction for people who are smoking?
Of course, Mr. Potts's government is making millions of dollars every year from a harmful product that gets ingested called alcohol. And we know how,
My fair share.
and I've contributed that. I think I should be, in fact, I think I should be getting a personal letter of thanks from Mr. Sousa. But anyway, I think the evidence is quite, if you look at the British evidence, which I think the British have done the best job on this, and the British at the very highest levels have studied this very, very thoroughly. And they have concluded, and again, the charge being led by people like Dr. Tyndall, whose background is in HIV, have said without a shadow of a doubt that the evidence is clear that the harm that is caused by tobacco is from the combustion of tobacco, not by nicotine. Nicotine, I'm not saying that it's benign, but it is a relatively low-risk substance. Its main effects are addiction and stimulation. Those are the two main effects. The harm that's caused to smokers is from the combustion of all the other crap that gets created when you smoke a cigarette, and that just doesn't happen when you vape. And to pretend that it does is completely unscientific in my view. So that is the number one evidence that we need. And the other evidence is really the reality. I mean, smokers have voted with their feet. The pharmaceutical industry, they're not going to invest money in something. The tobacco companies aren't going to invest money in something. It was the smokers themselves who realized that this worked, that they'd get the buzz that they wanted from this product without the negative side effects. And that's why the sales are skyrocketing everywhere, because it actually works as opposed to the other alternatives. Why on earth, in the face of scientific evidence that shows that risk is low and that the harm reduction to this terrible thing called tobacco smoking is, there's real evidence that it's working, do we need more? I mean, more would be helpful in the long run, but I'm certainly not going to be putting brakes on access for adults in those circumstances, because what you're doing is you're promoting harm by putting those brakes on. You're forcing people to, just like we used to force heroin addicts to use dirty needles, and we realized that that was a bad thing to do. We were causing more problems for them and more problems for us who are providing them with health care. To me, we have enough evidence now.
Yeah. Just one very
Quickly.
quick thing, because I think that Michael's point that people are not trying to tell people not to vape. I think in many countries they are telling people not to vape, and like something like place like Australia where they've made it illegal is very scary to me, because I think we're at a tipping point. There's countries that have massive fines and jail time for people. So I don't think Canada's that far over the point where we couldn't be pulling this thing back. And the legislation, the taxation, how it's allowed to go could really have a major impact in Canada about people's access to these products. So I still think we're not in a safety zone that everybody's saying, yeah, people should have access to harm reduction. I think we're very close to making a situation where it's very difficult for people to access these, and we got to be very careful of that.
I just want to mention that the idea of sales skyrocketing and cessation skyrocketing, unfortunately in Ontario at least, I can only speak to the Ontario data, is not borne out by the prevalence data. We've got the Canadian Community Health Survey showing that declines in prevalence have flattened out over the last 5 to 7 years. 2015 was identical to 2014, which was almost identical to 2013. We don't have data for last year yet. So we don't have evidence reflected in people saying whether they smoke or not that shows that there's a big change in the number of people who are stopping smoking for any reason. And one of the truisms in the cessation field is that most smokers who quit cold turkey. They don't quit using patch gum, aerosol vaping, anything else. They may have used them to get to the point where they can quit cold turkey, but most people quit cold turkey. What does that mean? I don't know what it means other than just it's a statement of fact as best we know it from the research, but there's a significant proportion of people for whom all the existing remedies don't work. And those are the people that we have to figure out how to promote vaping products to and make them accessible to them, I think. That's the cohort we need to get at, because there are a lot of people who try and try and try desperately for whom nothing else works, and vaping seems to have worked. We need to figure out how to fold that into our policies.
Thank you. So we're moving into our last question, which Mark keeps to give me good segues for. So we wanted to talk a little bit about how we have this patchwork of legislation across the country. So I've been struck as an observer of politics how governments have reacted to regulating this industry across the country. So the previous government, the Harper government, began to study the effects of vaping in Canada through the Standing Committee on Health, and its report sort of built the framework for national regulation. But many provinces attempted to legislate and regulate long before the federal government did. So here we are now in 2017. 7 of the 10 provinces have legislation and regulations pending or in place, which many proponents and critics view as this sort of patchwork and not really proper regulation. So, but now that Bill S5 has gone through its committee hearings, the Senate has rendered its report, will this new federal framework complement or usurp provincial legislation that has already been passed? And what, if any, constitutional roadblocks could be leveled against governments of any level? Doug, did you want to start us off on the constitutional question?
Well, I know a little bit about the Constitution. The key thing to know here, two things. First of all, health isn't mentioned under our Constitution. It's not a head of power, and as a result of which, all 3 levels of government have stepped in and done something, whether it's public health officials that are medical officers of health at the municipal level, provincial governments running our healthcare system, and the federal government with the Food and Drug Act and other regulations that are based originally on the criminal law power, the power to prohibit. And so when you have federal legislation, that's what you have to remember, that it comes from the power to prohibit. And the federal legislation, the general proposition is that once you have federal legislation, it's going to displace provincial legislation unless there's a way to find that they can coexist. And they do coexist in the tobacco area, for example, where the federal government has regulations regulating tobacco, and so does the provinces, and some municipalities also have regulations on the sales of tobacco as well. I think we are going to end up with somewhat of a patchwork, but I think what is heartening about the federal legislation is I think there are some things that anyone can agree ought to be regulated. You do not want a vaping device that's going to set your pants on fire. You do not want a liquid that's being sold that you think contains nicotine but actually contains fentanyl. I don't think any people who are involved in the vaping industry or who are vapors disagree with the notion that consumers are entitled to information about the products that they're getting. And in fact, one of the things that has been most frustrating for me as somebody who's an advocate of consumer choice is to see the efforts to restrict providing information at the retail level that is scientifically accurate. That to me is just boneheaded, and it's the nanny state at its worst. The reality is under Section 7 of our Constitution, as was demonstrated in the Insight case, and thank you for your work on Insight, Mark. BC always leads the way for the rest of us in this country. It takes a while for that wisdom to cross the coastal mountains and seep into the Laurentians. But the reality is that our right to choose as adults is a fundamental human right. We don't have to prove to Mr. Potts or anyone else that we're entitled to make a choice about our health. We have the right to make that choice, even if that choice is to die. That has been recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada. We don't have to prove anything. The onus rests with the government to prove under Section 1 of the Charter that restrictions on our free choices are justified based on evidence in a free and democratic society. That's what Section 1 stands for. So with all due respect to those who have different views about the role that evidence plays in this legislation, I think from a legal perspective, it's perfectly clear. If there's a healthier option that adults want to exercise, they should be free to exercise it until government comes up with the evidence that what they're doing is harmful to society in some way. And that evidence just isn't out there now. So as far as I'm concerned, the sections of the legislation that restrict the lawful activities of adults are constitutionally infirm because the government just doesn't have the evidence to back it up. It's more of, you remember Mr. Harper trying to shut down Insight in Vancouver. Why? Because it was against his government's policy. And the Supreme Court of Canada said, where's the evidence? People are dying. This is helping. Where's the evidence to back up this restriction? And his point was, because I said so. Not good enough in a court of law.
Very
Arthur?
If I didn't have a mic in my hand, I'd be applauding too. No, very eloquently put. And, you know, and it's precisely what you've identified there, which gave me cause for concern with the legislation we were bringing in after I met with Maria and her people. It was exactly that, the nanny state interfering and treating vaping products like tobacco, vilifying the product in the absence of us having information that it was like tobacco. And so that was something that, you know, struck me very profoundly. And I had those conversations in our caucus, and, you know, the petition was part of it. But we need to put a brake on this piece of it, because I think we're now stopping good things from happening. And so I think that was with Minister Deepika Demirel at the time. I think that was a message that was heard loudly, and that's why those sections in the regulations have not yet been activated, because we have taken that precaution against taking too much caution, if I put it that way.
We have 5 minutes to go, so I just wanted to let you know, but I want to make sure both Mark and Michael get a final word.
Okay, I mean, just to pick up on Doug, my whole reason for landing where I am is really based on a human rights perspective. And if this was a breast cancer drug that was shown to be highly effective, do you think we'd hold back and say all these women can't use this drug because we're not quite sure if there's downsides? Like, this is, to me, this is people's rights. We know they have a safer product. How can we possibly tell people that we're going to put everything in your way that you can't access this very easily? And we have to come out, not even, Stephen, that tobacco can't be, it has to be, we have to use this opportunity to highly incentivize people to use these products. And so we can't just accept that, okay, we'll treat them like tobacco. We're not going to really tell people they can't use them. But, you know, this is a public health opportunity to totally make vaping so much more attractive, from cost and convenience and everything that just crushes combustible tobacco. This is our opportunity to do that. So it's not acceptable that we say that, you know, we'll just make the same rules as tobacco, but we're actually not saying you can't use it. We have to, this is a public health issue that we can really, you know, crush combustible tobacco, and that's what we're all trying to do. And the other major issue that I have is dealing with very marginalized people who are suffering from what we consider much harder drug addiction than tobacco. This population is totally dying of tobacco. None of the things that Michael can offer have anything to do with an entrenched person using drugs in the downtown east side. They're not ever going to use patches or ever going to be offered them. This is a have been involved in cohort studies with thousands of people using drugs and homeless, and 90+% of people smoke, and they're all dying. They're not dying. None of my patients die of HIV anymore. They all die of tobacco-related illness, and we're doing nothing for the poor and disadvantaged people who are primarily the target of tobacco use. And so, and we can see that from the statistics of people who have mental illness diagnosis and the poor. The rates of tobacco use are just the same as they've been in the last 20 years. And the progress that we made has not been in the low socioeconomic groups of our population. And that's what I'm very much an advocate for, that this is a population with no voice that is dying needlessly of tobacco when we have something better to offer them. And so we really need to make this a situation where it's highly incentivized that people vape.
And the last word to Michael.
Well, I think to take up Mark's point, I think for the lower SES population, if you can put it that's not the right way to put it, but the poor and the disadvantaged, we get the argument all the time regarding health taxation of tobacco products that it unfairly disadvantages that group. However, when you look at the cycle of tobacco poverty, we call it, where head of household in lower income household gets cancer from smoking, and that whole family is thrown onto the welfare rolls as a result of the main breadwinner being out of work. You've got very much a tobacco-driven cycle of poverty, and I think we all agree that if there's a method to get those folks onto something less harmful, they should get onto something. They should be helped to get onto something less harmful. I don't know that anyone who goes into a vaping store in Toronto and pays what you have to pay for a device, I don't know whether those kinds of prices are available to the kind of people Mark's talking about. I don't know whether there's any, I mean, we have cig-alikes, but we know that they're very low nicotine and don't really work very well for cessation. We know that. The mods and the tanks work a lot better because you have higher nicotine levels. So I'm not sure that we have a product. I'm not sure we have a system to encourage use by the people that Mark's talking about. Just a final word on S5. I remember the debate over the Electronic Cigarettes Act in Ontario, and a lot of the vaping community came forward and said, we want a system of standards for manufacturing and approvals and all those kinds of things. Those are some of the things that S5 actually applies to the marketplace. So I think they'll be useful. I'm not sure about some of the rest of the Act. I do know that there's a lot in the Act about not providing inducements to young people to start, and also making health claims that can't be substantiated. Part of this arises from the US vaping market, where there is a lot of advertising out there, and they have the First Amendment, so they can advertise much more broadly, that advertises vaping just as a lifestyle, nothing to do with cessation. So I think some of the federal approach here is conditioned by that. But I think there are a lot of things in S5 that will help long-term the vaping industry, particularly vis-a-vis manufacturing standards, safety standards, and two streams of approval: therapeutic, Food and Drugs Act; recreational, this act, with less controls.
Thank you very much. I know we're about to get the hook. So on that note, I want to thank all of you. I know we probably could talk for about another hour. I could see people on the last panelist answer getting a little fidgety. But thank you, all of you, to MPP Arthur Potts, to Doug Elliott, to Dr. Mark Tyndall, and to Michael Purley for being here. That was a great discussion. Thank you.
And on behalf of the Economic Club of Canada, I thank you, Lisa, for leading such a thought-provoking and engaging discussion. Thank you to our expert panel for sharing their knowledge and insight. Thank you to our event sponsor, the Canadian Vaping Association. And last but not least, a big thank you to all of you. I hope you have a wonderful weekend and you have your umbrellas on the ready. Cheers.
No, I definitely will. Like, I literally talked to him as I was getting into the subway on my way. But that's also his thing, right? But, to his I'm going